I remember sitting in a lecture hall years ago with a professor who was absolutely fixated on Clovis points. He would project images of these fluted stone spear tips on the screen and speak about them with an almost giddy reference. To him, these stones were the smoking gun, the ironclad proof that the first Americans arrived exactly 13,500 years ago, walking across a land bridge to hunt mammoths. It was a neat, tidy narrative, a single wave of migration through a specific ice-free corridor. He loved that story because it was simple, it felt solved. But then, the conversation shifted to the bottom of the world, to a site called Monteverde in Chile. And that's when I saw his enthusiasm just curdle into something like defensiveness. Because the math of Monteverde destroys the neat story. Here was a settlement with organic remains and structures that existed 1,000 years before the ice corridor supposedly opened, and thousands of miles further south than anyone should have been. The moment you introduce those anomalies, or the ghost tracks found in the white sands of New Mexico that push the timeline back 23,000 years, that confident linear history just dissolves. You realize that the story of the Americas isn't about a single group walking across a bridge into an empty wilderness. It is a story of impossible timelines, coastal mariners following kelp forests, and massive complex empires that rose and fell long before a European ship ever touched the horizon.
That narrative, the simple one, has been, well, it's been thoroughly dismantled by the hard evidence. What you've just described is really the core mission of this deep dive. We are moving beyond that simplistic, linear view of history to reconcile a truly deep human history in the Americas with just unexpected levels of sophistication in engineering, logistics, and statecraft. We need to understand not only that people were there earlier, but how they built these advanced societies later on. So our goal is to connect the revolutionary archaeological findings, the shattering of the Clovis timeline, with the surprising sophistication of pre-Columbian governance, and then draw these really profound, unexpected parallels. Parallels between those American institutional marvels and the long-standing, highly centralized administrative traditions of ancient China. This is all about establishing a truly global understanding of deep historical roots and recognizing how complex institutional organization, it manifests universally.
Okay, so let's unpack that seismic shift that happened in archaeology. Because for most of the 20th century, the Clovis First theory was basically gospel. This idea wasn't just about a tool type. It was a complete model of migration. So maybe you can walk us through what defined that traditional model.
The Clovis First theory was, elegantly simple. It posited that humans entered the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge Beringia, which was exposed due to lower sea levels during the height of the last ice age. We're talking roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. But, and this is the key, the continent was locked down by massive continental ice sheets, the Laurentide and Cordilleran sheets. So the theory dictated that they had to wait for this very specific window when the ice sheets began to retreat, opening up a narrow interior ice-free corridor running from Alaska down to the North American plains.
And the physical evidence that supposedly marked their arrival, the smoking gun, that was the Clovis point itself.
That was the fluted Clovis point, exactly. These are spectacular, technically demanding stone spear tips, and they're often associated with hunting megafauna. These tools consistently dated to around 13,500 years ago, or about 11,500 radiocarbon years before present. So the logic was incredibly rigid. It was, no evidence of occupation could possibly be older than the time that specific corridor was viable. Any site that claimed older dates was immediately scrutinized and usually dismissed as flawed dating or contamination. It created a very neat but very fragile historical box.
Right, and that brings us to the ultimate wrench in the works, Monteverde II in south-central Chile. When you find a definitive occupation site thousands of miles south of the supposed entry point, and that site predates the entry point itself, well, the entire box just collapses, doesn't it?
It completely collapses. Monteverde is a masterpiece of both preservation and chronology. It's located in the cool, temperate Valdivian rainforest, which is an environment notorious for rapidly destroying organic remains. But due to some very unique geological circumstances, specifically the site being immediately sealed and saturated by a layer of anaerobic peat right after abandonment, it became an oxygen-free time capsule.
So it was perfectly preserved.
Perfectly. And this protection preserved materials that normally decay almost instantly, and that made the evidence absolutely irrefutable.
So how far back are we talking? What is the secure chronology for this site that just broke the whole model?
The cultural remains and the structures at Monteverde II are securely dated to at least 14,500 calibrated years. Before present, you'll often see that written as 14,500 Cal BP. Some researchers even suggest that certain layers push that closer to 14,800 years ago. So the fact that this settlement existed successfully in the far southern cone of South America a full millennium before the earliest Clovis dates established in North America, and thousands of miles from that ice-free corridor, it implies two things. First, human entry had to be significantly earlier than 13,500 years ago. And second, the dispersal rate south must have been astonishingly fast.
The preservation details, though, are what's so key. It's not just stone tools. What specific evidence of their daily life and, I guess, their knowledge base did the peat actually preserve?
The detail is stunning. It's evidence of a highly adapted, sophisticated population. They uncovered the remains of a long, internally segmented tent-like structure, complete with a wooden frame and evidence of cordage made from local reeds.
So a complex dwelling.
A very complex dwelling. The floor showed hundreds of microscopic flecks of hide tissue, indicating they used animal skins as coverings, as insulation. But the real insight into their adaptation came from their refuse.
Let's talk about the masticated cuds. I've always found that fascinating. It sounds strange, but it's incredibly revealing.
It is. Masticated cuds are essentially fossilized remnants of chewed material, like ancient chewing gum. Analysis of these revealed a complex, varied diet. And crucially, they found remnants of 3 to 4 varieties of non-local seaweeds.
Non-local, so they were traveling.
They were traveling or trading. Some of the sources for these seaweeds and medicinal plants like boldo, which is a known anti-inflammatory, would have required foraging trips to the Pacific coast, and the Andean mountainous habitats, we're talking sometimes up to 60 kilometers away. This demonstrates not a haphazard survival strategy, but a detailed, sophisticated knowledge of diverse, distant ecosystems and resource networking. They understood pharmacology and logistics.
Okay, so when the Monteverde dates first came out, they faced, as you can imagine, immense pushback. The critics insisted the dates were contaminated or flawed. How did the scientific community finally achieve consensus?
The skepticism was fierce because it overturned decades of established theory. The key was robust, multi-methodological redating. Specifically, new AMS radiocarbon dates, which require much smaller, purer samples and are highly precise, were run on non-cultural material. They analyzed samples from the peat deposits immediately adjacent to the occupation layer, a layer known as stratum MV5. This stratum formed after the humans left and naturally sealed the site.
Ah, okay. So they weren't just dating artifacts from the site, they were dating the geological seal itself.
Exactly. And the new assays, which were derived from cores taken 40 to 50 meters away from the actual cultural site to eliminate any chance of local human contamination, they consistently returned dates averaging 14,500 to 14,600 calibrated years before present at that post-occupation horizon. This independent verification of the sealing layer definitively reinforces the site's antiquity. It settled the debate. The cultural material underneath simply had to be older.
So Monteverde is the geographical proof that the timeline was wrong. Now let's move north to Oregon, to the Paisley Caves, which provides the biological, the genetic proof. This is where, paleogenomics really met archaeology head on.
Right. The Paisley Caves are a series of 8 shallow caves nestled in Oregon's arid high desert. And while the sediments there were complex and often bioturbated, which means they had been disturbed by burrowing animals and water over millennia, the preservation of fragile organic material in this dry environment was key. The discovery of preserved human coprolites fossilized feces, dating back 14,300 years, offered undeniable biological evidence of human presence.
And the rigor applied here was unprecedented, correct? I imagine because of the whole Monteverde controversy, the Paisley project needed to be absolutely watertight.
It was essential. The team, which included geneticists like Eska Willerslev, ran over 280 radiocarbon tests on samples from the site. This created one of the most comprehensive dating records in North America and established this really robust chronological sequence. The key, though, was extracting DNA directly from the coprolites. They confirmed the DNA was human, and specifically that it belonged to Native American haplogroups with origins linked back to Northeast Asia.
So that was the final nail in the coffin for critics who might have argued the droppings were from coyotes or other animals.
Exactly. It was human, no question.
What's fascinating about Paisley is that it didn't just confirm the age, it confirmed cultural diversity. They didn't find Clovis points there, did they?
No, not at all. They found something quite different. They uncovered tools belonging to the Western-stemmed tradition. These are narrow-stemmed projectile points, which date back as far as 14,000 years. This shows that pre-Clovis North America was not this homogeneous cultural landscape. There were separate, complex cultural traditions coexisting with or even predating Clovis, and the microscopic analysis of the coprolites further revealed a varied forager's diet. Grasses, seeds, berries, small rodents, fish, even beetles, indicating a flexible, sophisticated resource strategy far beyond the big game hunting stereotype.
So when we connect Monteverde, Paisley Caves, and circling back to the intro, the truly impossible date suggested by the White Sands footprints, which some estimates place at 23,000 years ago, it paints a picture of multiple ways of entry.
Absolutely. The White Sands National Park tracks, which are preserved in gypsum layers, are still undergoing rigorous evaluation, but the fact that the evidence is pushing the timeline potentially back to the last glacial maximum 23,000 years ago, that profoundly alters the entire discussion.
Yeah, it has to.
If people were already that far south, inland, when the ice sheets were at their greatest extent, the interior route was simply impossible.
So this overwhelmingly shifts support to the Pacific coastal migration theory. How does that theory envision the first Americans moving south so quickly?
It's often called the Kelp Highway Hypothesis. Instead of waiting for an ice-free corridor to open up inland, this theory suggests that maritime peoples already adapted to coastal life in Northeast Asia, navigated south along the unglaciated coastal margins of the continents.
A highway of resources.
A highway of resources, exactly. The Pacific coast during the Ice Age was likely extremely rich ecologically, featuring extensive kelp forests and nearshore resources, shellfish, fish, sea mammals, which would have provided a reliable, continuous food source. Using watercraft, they could have bypassed the insurmountable ice sheets entirely, establishing sites like Monteverde thousands of miles away relatively quickly. And then, from various landing points, they could have moved inland via river systems, which would explain the presence of sites like Paisley Caves in the high desert.
So it really transitions the story from a difficult one-way trek across a barren land bridge into a sophisticated maritime adaptation where success depended on ecological knowledge and watercraft technology.
Precisely. It's a story of ecological mastery from the very beginning. And it's that mastery that really laid the foundation for the massive human achievements that would follow thousands of years later as these populations adapted and built truly complex societies.
That deep history of arrival sets the stage perfectly, because the next critical idea we have to address is the sheer scale and complexity achieved by later American civilizations. We have to discard the colonial narrative of a sparsely populated land. These societies were massive, urban, and masters of their environments.
The jump from Paleo-Indian foraging to massive state organization is vast, but you're right, the underlying thread is this persistent ecological and organizational innovation. We're talking about urban centers that rivaled or even exceeded contemporary European capitals. I mean, take the Aztecs, the Mexica centered in the Valley of Mexico. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, founded around 1825, was an astonishing feat of city planning.
And the choice of location. A massive island in the middle of Lake Texcoco that presents some obvious challenges. Yet they created one of the largest cities in the world at the time.
At its peak, Tenochtitlan likely has between 200,000 and 300,000 people. Managing that population, especially with limited land for agriculture, demanded, well, genius. And their solution was the chinampa, the famous floating gardens. This wasn't just farming, it was massive-scale ecological engineering.
Can you describe the chinampa system in a bit more detail? How did they actually construct and maintain this high-yield agriculture?
Yeah, of course. Chinampas were human-made strips of fertile land constructed in the shallow lake beds. To build them, they would dredge up the rich lake bottom mud, organic debris, and decaying vegetation, and then pile it into layers separated by narrow canals. They'd often reinforce the sides with stakes and interwoven vegetation. This method created these incredibly rich, perpetually moist soil beds that essentially negated the need for fallow periods. They could cultivate up to 7 crops per year.
7 crops a year. That is unparalleled productivity. And maintaining the lake environment was just as critical as building the beds themselves, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The Valley of Mexico presented a critical hydraulic engineering challenge. See, Lake Texcoco was naturally brackish or saltwater, while the water coming in from the surrounding mountains was fresh. To protect the chinampas, which required fresh water, and to prevent flooding, the Aztecs constructed a massive system of dikes, causeways, and sluice gates to control the water flow, to separate fresh water from salt water, and to provide access to the city. This required constant coordinated state maintenance and really complex planning. The chinampa system provided the economic foundation that allowed this enormous urban population to thrive and sustain the entire Aztec tributary empire.
Okay, so let's move from the centralized market city-state of the Aztecs to the hyper-centralized logistical behemoth of the Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, in the Andes. This represents a completely different model of statecraft.
A completely different model, yes. The Inca Empire was the largest pre-Columbian political entity, and it extended over incredibly diverse ecological zones. Unlike the Aztecs, who relied on markets and tributary payments, the Inca ran a command economy managed directly by the Sapa Inca and his massive bureaucracy. The sheer scale of their infrastructure is what really underpinned this centralization.
The road system is the stuff of legend, right? Connecting the entire empire.
It was an engineering marvel built across mountains, deserts, and jungles spanning thousands of miles. This road network, the Qhapaq'nan, wasn't just for moving armies, it was the nervous system of the empire. It was maintained by state labor, and it facilitated rapid communication through chasqui runners who could relay messages via a relay system faster than any contemporary system in Europe. This rapid communication was essential for controlling a territory that large and diverse.
And the heart of their resource management was the mita system. This is a critical point of comparison for our later discussion. If the Inca lacked currency, how do they extract and distribute wealth?
The mita was a mandatory labor tax. So citizens owed time and labor to the state, not money. This labor was highly organized and scheduled by the state bureaucracy, directed towards specific projects: building roads, temples, managing agricultural terraces, or working in textile production. And while modern descriptions often focus on the element of forced labor administratively, it was a profound system of logistical organization. The state took the collected goods and stored them in these vast state warehouses, the kolkas.
And what was the goal of managing production and storage through this command economy?
The ultimate goal was stability and social welfare, all managed centrally. By storing massive amounts of staple crops, like dehydrated potatoes, which they called chunyu, the state could redistribute goods during times of local famine or disaster. This mechanism, driven by the mita labor and the massive storage facilities, was a powerful tool for maintaining political control and ensuring the survival of the population across varied and often challenging climates.
And all of this complex resource tracking, labor allocation, and population data was managed without a traditional written alphabet. Instead, they relied on the quipu. How did a system of knotted strings function as a central database for an entire empire?
The quipu is an extraordinary example of information technology developed in total isolation. It used colored, spun, and knotted strings hanging from a central cord. The placement and type of knot simple, long or figure-8 encoded numerical data using a base 10 system, much like an abacus, and then different colors and groupings would indicate different categories: inventory, population counts, taxes owed, or even astronomical data.
So an accountant or a bureaucrat who was fluent in the quipu could literally read the state's treasury records and census data from these strings.
Yes, precisely. Though it's debated whether the quipu also contained narrative or historical information, its primary function was as a precise administrative database. It allowed the central government to maintain perfect, portable records of its command economy, tracking how much maize was stored in Cusco, how many people owed labor in a distant province, and ensuring the mita obligations were met. This level of bureaucratic oversight, managed solely through tactile records, just proves that institutional sophistication is independent of paper and ink.
And to round out the American story, we can't forget the intellectual achievements of the Maya and the centralized urbanism we see in North America.
Exactly. The Maya, though politically fragmented into city-states like Tikal and Calakmul, were intellectual giants. They developed the only fully elaborated writing system hieroglyphs in pre-Columbian America. Their mathematical achievements included the concept of zero, which they used in complex calculations related to their very accurate calendar systems. And their monumental architecture, the pyramid temples, was built with an incredible understanding of geometry and astronomy.
And then there's Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, which again demonstrates that North America hosted massive centrally planned societies.
Cahokia was the center of the Mississippian culture, peaking between 1050 and 1200 CE, with an estimated population of 10,000 to 20,000 people. Its defining features were the massive earthen platform mounds. Monk's Mound, the largest, covers over 14 acres and stands about 100 feet high.
Wow.
Building a structure of that size entirely by hand requires immense centralized planning, organized labor, and a strict social hierarchy to direct the resources. They also constructed what's called woodhenge, these large circles of timber posts used for observing astronomical events, further underscoring their advanced understanding of cycles and their need for centralized timekeeping.
So the takeaway from this section is clear. The Americas were a landscape of massive, sophisticated states, the hydraulic engineers of Tenochtitlan, the logistical masters of Tiwanaku, and the centralized planners of Cahokia. And this complexity leads us directly into a global comparison. The Inca and Aztecs present two very different organizational models. You have the Inca hyper-centralized, state-managed logistics, and then the Aztecs, a large urban center relying heavily on markets, trade, and private land management. We're moving now to a historical framework that suggests this isn't random, that these are two opposed institutional systems found across the globe.
What's fascinating here is viewing history through the lens of what's called institutional clustering. Historians and economists suggest that since the Axial Age, so roughly the 8th to 3rd century BC, two opposed institutional systems have structured civilizations, and they differ fundamentally on how they allocate resources and power.
Okay, so let's start with the statist systems. We already have the Inca as a perfect American example. What are the universal characteristics of this model, using, say, ancient China as the prime Eurasian example?
Statist systems are fundamentally characterized by state control over resource allocation. If you look at the key institutional traits, first is property rights. Land is typically not privately owned by the common person. It belongs to the ruler, the emperor in China, or the Sapa Inca. Second, labor. Labor is often organized via state-mandated service, like the mita in the Inca Empire, or forced public service in ancient China. Slaves, if they exist, are typically the property of the government public slaves working on state projects like the Great Wall or public works. You don't see a thriving private slave market for households. And third, trade. Domestic markets are generally limited and weak because the state is managing resource allocation. Foreign trade is conducted by the government or strictly for the ruler's benefit. Private merchants are marginalized and often viewed with suspicion.
And their governance reinforces this whole structure.
Correct. Governance is highly centralized in these large territorial states. Their legal systems focus primarily on regulating the relationship between the ruler and the subject. They codify the duties and obligations owed to the central power, often with severe punishments for breaches of state obligation.
All right, now let's define the opposing side, the market systems. How does the Aztec model fit here alongside maybe ancient Mesopotamia or Athens?
Market systems thrive on decentralized allocation. So, property rights, private land ownership is prevalent, and markets for land are highly developed. Private wealth is protected. Then labor. Private slave markets are thriving, used in households and private enterprise, which is a stark contrast to the public slave ownership of the statist model. And trade. Developed markets are the engine of the economy, and private merchants hold significant social and economic power.
And their legal focus shifts entirely as well.
Yes. Governance is often decentralized into city-states. Their legal systems are focused almost entirely on conflicts between citizens, particularly conflicts over private property rights, inheritance, and contractual obligations. They establish rules for civil interaction rather than dictating duties owed solely to a supreme ruler.
So this raises the critical question of causation. Why did societies separated by oceans and millennia like the Inca and Han China end up with institutionally identical centralized states, while the Aztecs ended up resembling Mesopotamia?
The evidence suggests that geography was the powerful determinant, acting through basic economic principles regarding the benefits of trade versus specialization. Statist systems tended to prevail in areas with homogeneous conditions of production.
Okay, what does a homogeneous environment mean in economic terms?
Yeah. Well, think about the long, uniform Nile River Valley in Egypt or the Yellow River Plain in China. When the land, the climate, and the basic output like grain are roughly the same across vast territories, there's very little economic advantage in trading basic goods between one village and the next. Everyone grows rice or millet in a similar way.
Right.
However, there are massive benefits to coordination and specialization across that territory. Things like managing large-scale irrigation, flood control, or monumental public works like the Great Wall. This massive coordination requires a strong centralized state to enforce labor and allocate resources, which then evolved into that statist institutional cluster.
So centralization was the most efficient economic choice when the land was uniform. And conversely, the market systems emerged where the environment was heterogeneous.
Exactly. Market systems prevailed in areas with heterogeneous conditions of production. Think of Mesopotamia, where the north had stone, timber, and certain minerals, and the south had rich agriculture but lacked those raw materials. Or the diverse ecological zones of Mesoamerica that drove the Aztec trade network. This heterogeneity maximizes the economic benefits from trade. And to maximize trade, you need markets. You need protection for private wealth and security for private merchants. This environment naturally fosters the market institutional cluster with decentralized power.
This institutional clustering seems to have a profound cultural legacy, extending far beyond trade and property laws, and specifically impacting the divide we see between modern individualism and collectivism.
The long-term inertia of these ancient institutional systems is hypothesized to shape modern cultural traits. Statist systems, by their very nature, foster collectivism. In China, for instance, the long tradition of statist governance reinforced Confucianism, which is a fundamentally collectivist philosophy. It emphasized social rank, adherence to duty, and being embedded within the social structure, the younger brother to the older brother, the subject to the emperor.
Why does a statist system logically lead to collectivism? What's the connection there?
It's because rewards and security are channeled through the state or the clan, not through individual economic achievement. Since the state controls the land and large-scale projects, social prestige and stability are gained by conformity and fulfilling obligations to the collective, be it the clan or the empire. That ensures you receive your share of redistributed goods. Statist systems correlate positively with strong clan systems and negatively with individualism because standing out or achieving private wealth outside the state apparatus was institutionally discouraged, if not impossible.
And the market system then logically feeds individualism.
Absolutely. Individualism correlates strongly with market systems. The focus on private property, the development of legal systems to resolve conflicts between citizens, and the ability to generate wealth through private trade. It all fosters a culture where social prestige is gained by standing out and by individual achievement. Ancient Greek philosophy championed individual excellence in warfare, philosophy, and rhetoric. The entire legal and economic structure was designed to protect the rights of the individual, wealthy citizen, which reinforces that individualist mindset. The American examples, Inca as statist and Aztec as market, they perfectly illustrate this ancient, geographically determined institutional split that shaped subsequent cultural trajectories.
To truly appreciate the statist model's potential for complexity and its parallels to the Inca's logistical control, we need to do a deep dive into ancient China, particularly the Qin and Han dynasties. This was really the blueprint for large-scale, centralized, and highly efficient administration.
It was. The hallmark of early imperial China was the government's ability to exert powerful public authority, to integrate almost all talented and qualified individuals into public service. They recognized that the expertise needed to manage a territorial state of that scale, administrative, judicial, and technical skills, was essential for their institutional strength.
This sounds less like hiring and more like mandated service for the intellectual class. How did the state ensure it secured this monopoly on talent?
It was indeed heavily mandated. The state monopolized education to some degree, and they established clear obligations for those who received it. We have evidence from the Qin dynasty that enforced a statute imposing severe punishment on those who tried to avoid public service after completing literacy education provided by the government. So the high value was placed on public service not as an option, but as a mandatory duty owed to the state. This ensured that the most capable individuals were continually channeled into the bureaucracy. The state was the ultimate destination for expertise.
So let's explore how this government dominance manifested in the judicial system itself, contrasting it with the citizen-focused laws of the market systems we just discussed.
The Chinese judicial procedure was fundamentally dominated by state authority, and it diverged sharply from the adversarial party autonomy you'd see in, say, the Roman Republic. The trial style was transformed towards closed-door trials, known as cognitio, which was a thorough governmental investigation. The process was not about two equal parties presenting their case before a neutral judge. It was an official inquiry into a potential breach of state order.
So the official was not merely a facilitator, but an active investigator and judge.
Exactly. The government official handled the investigation and judgment directly. Parties were required to appear and be questioned in person by the official. Counsel, or legal representation, was not allowed, which just underscores the government's direct control over the facts and the narrative. Furthermore, the process was highly punitive, even in cases we would consider minor civil disputes, like debt.
Punitive even for civil cases. How was that enforced?
The atmosphere was one of governmental oversight and potential penalty. In debt cases, for instance, both parties were explicitly warned of potential punishment for making false claims before they even provided their evidence.
Wow.
Yeah. This established that the proceeding was viewed by the state as a matter of enforcing order and truth, not merely resolving a private conflict. Any delay in the process without a justified reason also resulted in a penalty, driving efficiency and reinforcing state control.
A system this vast, a territorial state spanning hundreds of thousands of square miles, requires phenomenal data management to remain centralized. How did the bureaucracy maintain coherence and control across such great distances?
The entire system was structured hierarchically, and the hierarchy itself served as the review and appeal system. To maintain central authority and institutional coherence across remote corners, the government was entirely dependent on documentation. This is where the Chinese bureaucracy truly excelled: document-based governance.
So this was essentially a massive, highly detailed paperwork machine.
Precisely. Authorities were required to record judicial processes in minute detail. All communications among governmental agencies, from a local magistrate reporting a minor dispute to a regional governor appealing a sentencing decision, were required to be made in writing. They developed a sophisticated official postal delivery system to ensure these administrative dossiers and decisions reached the central authority promptly and accurately. Obligatory review procedures were installed for important cases, ensuring the central government maintained oversight and consistent application of law across the entire empire.
And if we compare that reliance on documentation to the market systems, what is the key difference?
Well, take the Roman Republic again, a classic market system. Trials there were predominantly oral. The process was adversarial, and the written record was often limited to procedural premises, the initial claim, the verdict, but not a detailed record of the trial proceedings themselves. The Chinese system, driven by that centralized power, required an exhaustive written record of the cognitio process to ensure that a bureaucratic superior could verify the administrative actions of a subordinate official thousands of miles away. It was a machine built on documentation. It was a structural necessity for maintaining institutional strength over a vast territory, much like the Inca required the quipu to manage resources over the Andes.
This deep dive has spanned continents and millennia, from the earliest mariners adapting to coastal kelp forests to the peak achievements of complex state organization. We've really reached two major interconnected takeaways that profoundly reshape our understanding of human history. First, the story of the Americas is demonstrably one of deep antiquity, multiple migrations, and sophisticated adaptation, definitively proving the pre-Clovis presence through rigorous science at sites like Monteverde and Paisley Caves.
And second, when we analyze the institutional structures of the later American empires, the logistical mastery of the Incas' state-managed economy via the Mita and the Quipu, and the Aztecs' advanced ecological engineering via chinampas, we find these compelling, powerful structural parallels in the highly centralized, document-driven status systems of ancient China.
It really reveals that the development of highly advanced governance, capable of supporting monumental infrastructure and massive, dense populations, is fundamentally a universal challenge in human history. And the solution always involves the highly efficient organization of information and resources.
These comparisons illustrate that civilizations cluster into institutional types, statist or market-based, largely on the geographic and economic conditions that maximize either specialization or trade. The story of human civilization is a universal one of adaptation and institutional clustering, visible in the Chinese bureaucracy's reliance on written dossiers and the Incas' reliance on the knotted string database, proving that institutional genius transcends technological medium.